Welcome to everybody. This is the Emancipatory Futures Studies public platform. This is a new knowledge project at Wits University, and I'm the principal investigator for it. My name is Vishwa Satka. We have several thrusts around emancipatory futures, but our primary premise is about exploring subaltern conceptions of the future. So if you go to a business school, you learn about how corporations think about futures and government technocrats think about futures and so on. And they use particular methodologies to think about futures. They extrapolate from very shallow trends and things like that. And they tell us about scenarios. But this particular project is grounded in a research agenda that seeks to understand how climate change is impacting on our lived world. So that's the first big thrust around this. How is it changing temporality? How is it changing our social conceptions of time through its disruptions, its impacts, its shocks, etc. The second thing about this program is that it is about understanding that the subaltern has been dreaming and desiring a better world, historically speaking. So it's to really look into history and unearth those moments of subaltern assertion, struggle, desire for something better. It's also about thinking with utopia and dystopia as forms of thought to pose questions about our present and where we are going. It's also about decolonizing futures. Now, sometimes the archive of the subaltern in the context of decolonization is reduced to what is the colonial archive. But actually this archive is still living and breathing in the present. And it's something we're also trying to grapple with. We're also about indigenous approaches to the future in this project. And this again overlaps with this idea of decolonizing the archive. And we have a great speaker who really, if you like, take us into this living archive that's still with us. We are also focused on systemic pathways into the future. So the future is being built now. There is another world that is being imagined, that is being lived, that is being struggled for now. And this project is mapping that other world, basically. Our webpage will be going live in a few weeks' time, hopefully. But we've mapped over 300 emancipatory futures projects on planet Earth, thinkers, etc., that are really struggling to build something different. So that's coming. And then finally, we are all about grand ecocentric futures. So how do we get to a decarbonized civilization? How do we get to post-carbon democracies, etc.? So anyway, that's the big agenda. But tonight, and on this platform, we've had several thinkers, practitioners from the grassroots. We kicked off this space with Mazibuko Jaha from rural Eastern Cape, in Tinga and Tabakadoda, and the work they've been doing around pioneering a pathway for community-based participatory planning, solidarity economy, food sovereignty, etc. But tonight, we also have a star, activist and practitioner from South Africa, Zayaan Khan. And Zayaan is from Cape Town. She works in understanding nuances within the food system by navigating land from an interdisciplinary perspective. She's firmly rooted in a socio-political context, and she works at unhinging our dependence on neoliberal consumption. I love that. Currently, she's interested in food through the lens of art, specifically to find ways to share stories both of struggle and solution and how this influences self-care. Zayaan is currently completing a master's within the Environmental Humanities program at UCT. The research is entitled From Seed as Object to Seed as Relation. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello everyone. Welcome. Just to say there are apples and juice.
Yeah.
Please don't be afraid. I don't mind if people are eating, because eating is important and it's this time of the day. Also just to say that we're filming, so if it's fine for me to stay here, I also have this crutch that I have to refer to each time, so I'm going to be here. So yes, my name is Zayaan. Vish and I know each other a few years through NGO work, climate change work, food sovereignty work. And I used to, maybe to give you a brief background of why it is that I come to be the one to give this talk. And so I've worked with land organizations for a good few years, almost 10 years now. I studied first journalism and linguistics at the university, currently known as Rhodes. I don't know if they've changed their name yet. But that didn't work out for me, so I studied landscape design and horticulture. And very quickly, my research became about food. And I did a green roof research in the city of Cape Town because there's this huge story about the so-called spatial limitation that the city of Cape Town has in terms of access to land and agriculture. And soon after that, started working for an organization called Surplus People Project, which comes from a movement on the west of the country around surplus people, so people who are forcibly removed, displaced peoples, apartheid government called surplus people. So this was a project to find a solution or to figure out what the hell is going on. And my work within SPP was around supporting producers, emerging farmers in understanding seed culture, because it's something that's almost completely disappeared on the west side of the country, and supporting in production. So from that kind of horticultural perspective, but also in terms of food, because when we talk about land, it's not assumed that food is part of that. It's actually, in terms of disciplines, quite separate, which is weird. And also as a researcher, so I would, lots of policy stuff, lots of lobbying stuff, so all kinds of things. And one of the big discrepancies within food was especially the further out of the Cape you go, out of the city you go, further east and further north. This, as rural as you go, and this is true for the continent, there's so much dependency on supermarket systems of food, even if the supermarket is far away. And this idea that our food we access through a means of financialized wealth. So this is very problematic when the majority of South Africans are living with less than, or just I think it's now about 46% of South Africans live with less than 1,000 rand a month. And when we think about things like basic basket of food and how much things cost, etc. So I'm going to take you through, do this kind of like a story, which helps to tell the story because it's quite complex and it speaks to a social, spiritual politic, which is not an easy thing to just talk about unless you're writing a thesis and reading it out. So in 2008, I was working for this private nursery in Cape Town, very old money, old estate. It's a, what do you call it, a heritage building within the Cape. Very like English country, colonial chic, we can call it. But this garden that I was running a nursery, and I had to kind of maintain the flow of the estate garden. And so I would have the seed bank and kind of archive and take care of all the plants that would fulfill the estate, but also for sale to the public. But they had this, and they still have this kind of medieval garden. And the medieval garden is a garden you would find in a monastery. It is typically symmetrical. It has 4 beds, which represent the 4 corners of the world. And it is separated by a path in the shape of a crucifix that always has a water-centered point, right? A well with some kind of feature. And in each garden, it's like fruit, flowers, herbs, and vegetables. It will be something like that. But each plant within this garden has to be of heirloom variety, like they did in the medieval times as a monastery garden. And we talk about plant breeding as well. A lot of plant breeding in Europe used to happen within monasteries and within around church land. And so there's this long heritage of how kind of cultivation of heirloom varieties, of heritage varieties. So this was the focus of this garden in Cape Town, South Africa. And the owners used to fly, they had this annual retreat to England and France, and then they used to bring seeds back, like smokel seeds back with them. And then they'd be like black tomato seeds, or all these varieties of basil that we'd never seen before, or red carrots and like stuff like this. Like, what? 2008, there wasn't living seeds back then. There wasn't seed companies to tell you about these things, and it wasn't trending. So it was like shocking. Like, how are these things? Like, obviously these things exist, but how is it that they are still cultivated and they find their path all the way through the world through these random people? In my experience, and it got me thinking, and it really kind of piqued this inquiry into what our own heritage in terms of seed and our own heritage in terms of our indigenous food within the Cape. Because remember, the Cape is, if not still, one of the highest rates of endemism in the world. This means that the plants and the insects and the minerals and the soils and the life that exists within the Cape exists nowhere else in the world, nowhere else in the country. And so what were people eating? Where were the foods? How did they disappear? And what kind of steady cultivation could bring them back? And did we want to bring them back? Where were they? What were they? And so I would literally I was younger then. I used to go around, and if I was in the queue at the bank or at the supermarket or whatever, then I would ask people in front of me, or on the train, ask questions and say, okay, what kind of foods did you grow up with? Stranger, person I've never met. When I speak about indigenous food or veldkos, what do you think of? What does it remind you of? And typically the responses were always like rooibos, maybe buchu, snoek, and then you would have to have this like pull it out of people to kind of engage. Why even have a conversation like this? And what do you even mean by indigenous? What even is it? So the concept of having food that is directly from here back then was kind of a foreign, that sounds funny, but kind of a foreign topic. And so I took it upon myself to, I guess also because I've got a very curious nature, but to explore this and to research this and to find things that were missing. And through a lot of process of experimentation, working through doing different substitutions. So we're going to go through these plants that we've brought here and some of the things and explain what I mean by that. But literally experimentation to the point that, not naive, I'm going to call it brave, where I would be eating things that I knew there was kind of a hint in a book somewhere that it was edible. But maybe that plant species is extinct, or we don't get it where I live. So I would go to the cousin of that plant and experiment with that. Or I would harvest a whole lot of seaweed, and then I'd want to smoke the seaweed to cure it, to dry it and keep it, for much longer than it is wet. And would go around my neighborhood. There's also I didn't have a car then, and I was just kind of just use what you got where you are. And harvested a whole lot of wood that I then burned to make smoke, to smoke the seaweed. Started feeling funny, it tasted a bit rancid and strange. Google it later, no, you should not burn that wood. So these kinds of mistakes, and not just in terms of food, but in terms of practice. So if I know that, certain plants, or I hear from someone, this is the other thing, when you hear something of new information from someone, don't just take it as truth, you have to research. And so I usually always do that, except this one occasion, I went on a botanical walk with a botanist in Stellenbosch, And he was saying that, this plant you can use to brush your teeth with. And I was like, oh, that's amazing, because I have shit teeth. I need new solutions. And so I took some and I brushed my teeth at night. And I woke up at about 1 o'clock in the morning with heart palpitation and this anxiety and this panic and like a soft cold sweat. So I messaged my mother, bless her heart, and I said, listen, I brushed my teeth with this plant last night and I feel very weird. Please, when you wake up, can you just check that I'm still around, And my poor mother would get a lot of these kind of messages. And then I fell asleep again, woke up at about 3 o'clock, still felt funny, but I didn't feel worse. So I was like, okay, that must mean that it's okay. And then I went back to sleep and I woke up, it was fine. And my teeth were clean, so it was okay. But there's lots of this kind of experimentation because the references are very thin, right? In terms of my knowledge, also in my lineage, there's not a lot of written knowledge, it's all oral. Like everything is spoken. But through, which we'll discuss now, through coloniality, apartheid, forced removals, genocide, all of these very real experiences and realities, this oral history is severed. So it's not diminished. In many parts, it's extinct. And how do you grapple with recovering knowledge or recovering culture, creating tradition that works and that sticks, right? And it's the same thing, with food, it's the same thing with seed. And so when we speak about substitution, one of the things is to say, okay, we have traditional knowledge. So we understand, and also don't quote me on this, but something like it takes one generation to create a tradition. That's what I was taught through the Slow Food Network, but what I take that to mean is that in one life experience, we can say about 35 years, that's around, I think that's like if that's a generation, anyways, okay, so in 35 years, that's that many years of experience, of knowledge, of knowing, of living, and in order for it to be a tradition, it has to be passed on, right? So it's the interface between those two generations, but it has to have lasted at least one generation. So one of the processes that led me to here and to understand indigenous food was to understand all the things, very luckily, but when I was around 19, I went through a crisis, I had a very dark depression, and one of the solutions that I came to was that I need to heal my body because my body is not healthy and it's exacerbating my mental health. So how I did that was through many different things happened, but essentially wanted to understand how I was spending my money. So at that stage I'm living at home, I'm not paying rent and stuff like that, but I still need to understand where this economy goes that comes through me and how far does it travel. And specifically, what am I spending my money on in terms of my own survival? So also was a very sickly child, and I used to say to my mom, but if I was a Springbok, the Lions would have got me long ago, because I'm always sick, because I have asthma, I have all these things that make me think that if this was not the kind of environment that we live in now, and it was much more towards a natural way of being or antiquity, that I would freak very soon. I would be one of the first to go. But yet, as a human in this time space, I so far have survived a generation, 35 years, and have learned so much that I can also teach so much. So somehow I'm glad I'm not a Springbok. I'm still alive, I can still have all these experiences. But it was so baffling to me that my survival was so dependent on a financialized system. I had to spend rands to get food. I had to spend rands to wash my hair and be clean and smell nice and have fun and all of those things. And it drove me crazy because it was also a very privileged perspective of how to live and navigate, especially a city like Cape Town, where the rand is the most expensive. And so one of the things I started exploring was traditional knowledge around all these things that I could save money on. So, for example, my hair. I grew up with my hair very straight. because we grew up thinking that it's better to have straight hair. There's nothing wrong with having straight hair, even if you have curly hair and straightening it. But I never knew that I had curly hair until I stopped washing my hair and let it just be as it is. And now it's bye curly, you know? And these lessons that I learned about myself through this practice. And one of the things around the hair situation was traditional knowledge teaches us that you can condition your hair with rosemary. Okay, this is like, if you'd like dive into the plant world of traditional knowledge, that's one of the obvious things. But I also know that we have a kind of a rosemary which is not the same, but in terms of indigenous knowledge, what does that say to hair conditioning? And so what do? So I do a lot of food transformation, and so I start fermenting rosemary. So I can make an acidic conditioner, because a soft acid allows the hair follicle to lie flat. So I started doing that and started conditioning my hair, and it started changing my life, right? So these are the kinds of methods and methodologies, and it sounds like a little bit lame and crazy, but these are the things that open up the portals to allow a lot of knowledge. So in Cape Town, I'll paint a little picture for you about the Cape. It is a space of immense antiquity. South Africa and the southern region, there are land masses that are around 1 billion years old. That is such a big part of the Earth's lifespan. And the Cape having been underwater for until about 5 million years ago, I think, roughly, something like that. There is evidence of humanity living in the Cape, along the coast, anything from about 60,000 years to 100,000 years, which is a lot older than what the current kind of research is saying, right? And so the Cape sits at an origin of humanity. So our species evolved and adapted in ways that has allowed us to be the way we are, cognitively, but also in reference to the supernature and the way that we relate to all other things that exist in the earth. And this is now, of course, within the Cape, which is a space of high endemism, like I said, right? And this high endemism, not, I don't know this for fact, but I suspect, or I would allude this to the fact that the Cape runs down into the city, it runs into peninsula, and the very freezing cold Atlantic Benguela current comes from the South Pole and goes up towards the west, past Namibia, and the Indian Ocean current comes down through the Mozambican Channel, like Indian Ocean side, and brings warm water down south. So there's a lot of temperature and movement happening in a very specific margin, and this gives a lot of life to what's, I think, called the Great Atlantic Reef, which is where all the kelp lives. So kelp is our version of a forest. We don't have many trees in the Cape traditionally, but our forest lives underwater. And the kind of diversity that exists underwater there at the Cape is so much more than what exists on the land, that if you step into the ocean on a rocky shore and under your 1 foot, there are thousands upon thousands of species of things that live and things that are almost invisible to our eye. You have to kind of go in with a microscope. But so there's so much abundance of life within the Cape, and not only is there so much life, a lot of it is edible, but the abundance is, if we can use the word, generous. There is a lot of all things due to eat. So back in the day, before colonialization, the Cape has always been a very kind of a welcoming space. Because of many factors, people have always been very open and sharing, and have also been able to communicate in ways without having to speak the same language, right? And I'm not trying to romanticize it, I'm just giving a very brief story. And the kind of abundance of food that used to exist in those times was things like, we'll go through it here also, but lots of geophytes. So in the Cape, we don't have a lot of grasses like you do here. okay? Sorghum and millet and all the other kinds of grasses. In the Cape, it's a lot less. It's a lot more about bulbs and geophytes, lots of starchy underground deliciousness that takes a whole night to cook to make it even palatable, but they are in abundance. So this time of year, if you go down to the Cape, you'll just see like big green leaves popping up all over the place, and these are a lot of these geophytes. And then one thing that's also that we often forget to discuss when we speak about indigenous food is that within the Cape, because of those two oceans, we literally have almost like, and you need to have taste superpowers to know this, but 2 different flavors of salt, or two different styles of brine. Okay, so when we look at food preservation from the other, if you look at food from another perspective, in terms of preservation and food transformation, which is the changing of food in order for it to be digestible. Anything from cooking to smoking to fermenting, all of those kinds of things. The ocean is the original brine. That salt content is a perfect ratio of salt to water to store food for a long time. And so this is something that is easy to utilize within the Cape. It doesn't matter what kind of year it is. And then on top of that, in terms of generosity and abundance, there has been a lot of different life forms. A lot of insects and insects who swarm at certain times of the year, much like here. A lot of ants and termites to eat. A lot of buck and rabbit and hare, all kinds of animals to hunt. And engage with and share or steal food from. So it was a lot more of an understanding that even if I'm just going to say cheetah was hunting, you could share a meal with a cheetah. You don't even think about doing that these days. People don't even share meals with their dogs. And then also within the coastal zone, so the beauty of that reef that lives near the Cape is that in this coastal zone you have octopus and alikrikel and perlemoen to your heart's content back in the days, and sea urchins whose eggs, it's actually gonads, you eat with a relish, limpets, perifuchis, very nutrient dense, easily bioavailable seaweeds of all kinds. There's only one seaweed you can't eat. Fish, clams, krief. It's like the food of the gods. They're in abundance in the Cape. And what would be so amazing is that when the tides go in and out, so now a lot of the rocky shore has been buried by concrete and roads and things, but you would have a lot of these rock formations that allowed for when the tide went out, you could trap fish. And so it was literally just using a spear to catch them or taking them up with your hand. And also back in the days before there was all this industrialization, there was very little, or you could guarantee that when a whale washed ashore, you could harvest from the whale. There wasn't a thing about, oh no, too much plastic, or it died because of an oil breach, or so something nasty happened at sea that we don't understand anymore. And so this idea of like this abundance and easy access to abundance. So if you go, I don't know if it's like that here also, but people talk about fish oil. So vegetable oil, right? Do people call it fish oil around here? Fish oil. Sorry, yeah, I was trying to say that, it didn't come on. So fish oil. So in the Cape, so we kind of also did this research with my family and then with the communities around Mitchell's Plain to say, okay, but why do you call it fish oil? Why is it called fish oil? Because it's vegetable oil. It's sunflower oil, it's unnamed just vegetable oil, maybe it's canola oil. And people will always say, across the board, every single response was, because we fry fish with it. I say, but you're also doing other things. Aren't you also like frying fed cook with it? Aren't you also frying samosas with it? Why is it called fish oil? And it goes back to the fact that the coastline is dotted with many different whaling stations. But not only that, like I say, people were able to access whales and they would harvest the blubber, render the blubber to provide a very, I always forget this, which is Fish oil is like polyunsaturated, high, what is it? Polyunsaturated. So it's really healthy for you. And it's high in all the omegas. And so you like much more welcome to fry your samosas or your fish with whale oil than you would do with vegetable oil, which is unsaturated. How do we call fish oil? I mean vegetable oil? Unsaturated. Yeah. So then you have a lot more likelihood of things like cholesterol and hypertension and all the things that are aggravated through our diet. Okay, it came out very gobbledygook, but you get my point. And so whale oil is something that, I mean, my mother still remembers going to buy whale oil at the shop in Darling Street. And so not only do we have all these different access to foods, but the knowledge and the practice that it takes to procure those foods. So you can't just harvest the Watsonia and think you can just eat it like an apple. It needs to go through a long process before it is transformed in order to be eaten. The same with the whale fat. You're not just going to, you have to render it and then it gets stored. And usually it used to get stored in dry kelp bulbs, like bottles, or in skin sacks, as well as things like ostrich eggs. Okay? Then the main thing about the Cape that makes it so attractive and has made it so attractive to many, many generations of travelers before the Dutch came to the Cape was the fact that it has such amazing sweet water. And in fact, this is the last original name of the Cape, right? It was Camissa, the place of sweet waters. And to the point that even if we are in a day zero reality, which is important, the mountain acts as a massive sponge. So you've got two oceans around the feet of the mountain, a lot of aquifers, a lot of riverways. The mountain basically lives as a space for water to live. With the cloud always there on the top, it's all about water. And this water has always been easily accessible because the rivers used to run all over the place before development, right? And so it's precisely because of this sweet water that encourage is the right word, but encourage colonizers to stay and set up camp. And then put brick and mortar to that camp. And build a kind of satellite station for kind of an in-way, actually, for the Dutch East India Company, which is really the Cape's first experience of a multinational corporation. So all the stuff that's happening now, with all the collusion, with companies, it's not a new concept. It's just much bigger now because they have more money and more power, and it's been happening for a lot longer. But the Dutch East India Company was the first iteration of this, where a lot of importation of different plants to cultivate through agriculture. Big fisheries companies were all set up for export, for passing trade. So to procure, produce, and supply outside of where it was grown. So obviously there is a market internally, but that's not the main objective. So this idea of all the goodness flowing out is, hundreds of years old. One of the things that Dutch also did was this idea, which kind of stayed for a long time, was to make indigenous peoples akin to animals. And so there were laws that would allow you to hunt people. And obviously also with the influx of things like smallpox, which decimated up to 90% of the population. There were a lot of things antagonizing people's very existence. And people who, like I said, almost 100,000 years of knowledge in a space, in a population is 35 years. And then what the Dutch also started doing was started creating barriers. So this kind of encouraging a future apartheid by starting it back then. And literally creating, if you can say, like swathes that prevent people from crossing the river, so the Black River in this case. preventing people from coming into the mountains, which there are such specific access is needed for around rites, around spiritual practice, around harvesting. Maybe people lived there, but they were just kind of cut off. And the initial reason was to keep the cattle out of their grounds, out of the Dutch grounds. But essentially that means the people as well. And so this idea of cutting access off to the mountain is also ultimately about water, because that's where most of the water is coming from. And yes, there are springs around the city, but that was the majority of it. And so this idea of the cultivation in the way the Dutch had also, it springs to mind this idea that we are treating, or they have begin this idea of treating the land in a very copy-paste way. So importing methodologies of agricultural practice that were not being practiced at the time. So we did have agriculture. Everything as, I'm going to use the word timid, as if we were dwelling in this cave, I go out and harvest, and I gather, and I process in my space of living, then I discard seeds outside of the cave. So I have a friend, Zayaan, who's an archaeobotanist. So she does a lot of work around combing through all the detritus and all the stuff that was left in the caves. She spends a lot of time in the slave lodge and stuff like that. Really trying to understand what plants we see there and how kind of building a seed bank also around this. So I'm privy to a lot of this kind of archaeological information. And you would see around caves there are certain plants that are a lot bigger than the ones that are further away. And this idea of kind of building a garden, but out of the endemic indigenous plants, because that's all you had most. There wasn't people coming from Europe to swap plants with you, or a global trade of botany. But also, not only that, apart from husbandry and farming with animals, this method of kind of farming in mounds is how things used to be. And it's very different to the kind of flat land, expansive monoculture that began to be adopted, and it kind of is what the current agricultural industrial complex has adopted. So one of the ways to explore a lot of this, and one of the ways to begin to even find ways to experiment, is to look in the very difficult but necessary out-of-print cookbooks. So there's a lot of information in those cookbooks, and they're so racist, and it's not easy to read. But you have such notations as, we relished the penguin eggs, or managed to find some flamingo eggs, or stuff like that, stuff we would never eat these days. And so you can kind of see, because the people who are documenting obviously are coming in from Europe. And the amount, talk about the abundance of perlu. And we know that, because that's, poaching is a very recent thing. But this idea of poaching even is not a very recent thing in the way that it is now, because we used to have a lot more animals than we did, before the Dutch came. And so this idea of removing life, it's a very, I think we spoke about dystopian and utopian. How I understand utopian is that it's that ideal living situation, but from a very specific perspective, whereby I don't see poverty, but poverty exists, but I don't get to see it. Where pollution doesn't exist, but it does exist, I just don't get to see it. And all the recklessness that we need to do to acquire the kind of wealth that we want to have or wish to have is not the kind of utopia that I think used to exist just by being alive, pre-colonization. And yes, there was hardships and all of that stuff, but the accounts from people, and if you just kind of plug back into that way of being and living, is a sense of euphoria, not just happiness, but a supreme connection with everything else that lives. So thereafter, closer to where we are now, the British then came in too. And they brought with them what I just call a very imperial chic, right? It's something that is, it's an imperial chic. It is something that has created a lot of aspiration. We were all kind of, especially through the English and Afrikaner, that it began to happen thereafter, where all of us that grew up Afrikaans were then taught and spoken to in English, because English is the language of the Queen, and because it's a much more international, you know, you'll do better in your life, etc., etc. And not quite understanding how those small changes within our cultural heritage and how we raise our children can affect us in later life, right? Not only that, it's those kinds of aesthetics like straight hair and all of those things, and conformist educational systems where everybody has to look the same and act the same, and not allow for a kind of diversity or expression that can be very damaging, especially if you are not that kind of person. But it's really around conformist ideology and how the influence of the British kind of moved throughout the Commonwealth, but made such a strong kind of resonance even today. And it's so funny because within, so if I can say my heritage as far as we know is kind of so-called Cape Malay, right? I have a very specific, we know that my grandmother was Cape Malay, and then my other grandmother had a little bit of Dutch, and then my grandfather, don't know where he's from, but he used to say a little bit of French, but I don't think that's true. And then my other grandfather was Afghanistani, and his father was from Pakistan, but back in the day it was one, it wasn't two separate countries, blah, blah, blah. So you can see through these kind of foods that we inherited, these kind of Cape Malay cuisines, and tracing it back, because it's well documented, right? There's lots of cookbooks now that are not racist. But tracing it back and seeing how the influence of such a global trade system, like through the British and the spice trade and having access to all these spices, linked to the fact that a lot of slaves who went to cook for masters in the Cape were Malay and brought spices with them, and how you get this kind of melting pot of all of that. And so in my own heritage, like desperately seeking where is the indigeneity, and who even am I to be researching this stuff and doing the deep dives into this work. And I think the first kind of connection was the sea, because my father was a fisher. He used to go fishing all the time. We used to eat lots of alikrikkels, lots of periwinkles, lots of seaweed, lots of snook, lots of yellowtail, all of the things. And all the recipes that would flow out abundantly from that there are so many cookbooks these days about Cape Malay cuisine. And recently, having married, my husband is Indian descent, and seeing how that mix, like very, very mixed heritage of Indian heritage, has made its way into the Cape and has also created these kind of recipes. And so this idea of the generational, like passing on traditional recipes, but then also freaking them and hacking them with a lot of indigenous stuff as a way to create, I guess, a new kind of archive, which is through food as a cookbook, but from a past through into the future, but from a very distant past also. So it's this concept that we call the ancient futures, right? It's really also working within this transitional space. There's this ecofeminist writer, Gloria Anzaldúa. She's Mexican, and she speaks to the borders, the frontiers, the in-betweens. This notion that she calls the Nepantlas. So the Nepantlas is people that have been born indigenous, but because the world is the way the world is, they don't have access to practice their indigeneity, if I can use that word. And so they find themselves in this in-between. Well, their heritage is indigenous, but they're such silly people that all of that stuff is disconnected or lost. And so this idea of that in-betweenness, and how do we find peace with the fact of utilizing indigenous knowledge that is basically extinct, creating new knowledges that potentially could be solutions to future concerns or even present concerns like food security, is a way of navigating all of that. And one of the things that makes it difficult to do that is that even though we have such an abundance of amazing food in the Cape, a lot of the plants are very, 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 very bitter. So that when you eat them, you feel like maybe you're gonna die. It's like it tastes like, no, but this is poisonous, man. No, I shouldn't be eating it. But then you go back in the texts, or you eat it and you don't die, and you feel better, and you begin to understand that. But one of the things that colonization also did was really mess up my potential to taste. I love me a good bready and stuff, right? But I'm not gonna just go out and eat bitter food. But back in the day, that was a common thing, because that's what you had. And this idea of not just over-salting and the way industrialization has kind of put oil and salt in everything, but the way sugar has also, I think through the British the sugar came, and how you can create a whole coastline of sugar plantation and put sugar in everything. That it affects our ability, but our potential to taste the finer flavors, where before you had labels and before things were all packaged and industrialized, you had to be able to taste in order to survive. If something tasted a bit maybe I shouldn't eat this, maybe it's got worms in it, or whatever. And this is very true. So I started fermenting obsessively and do a lot of fermentation, and that's one of the things that you realize is through a synesthetic experience, right? Using your sense of smell and the sound and the way things look and the taste. And by just kind of mapping that in your bodily experience, you can begin to tell when something is going off before it goes off. You can tell where, ooh, this bacteria is not the bacteria I wanted for my food, and maybe it's going to make me sick. I can stop the growth of that bacteria by adding more salt or changing the brine, or whatever the case is. The same with mildew, So mildew exists, like here in sour figs, they exist so much in the top, and if I want to use that food, that's the reason why we cut it off. Yes, because it's like gritty and dusty and fluffy, but because there's a lot that lives in that space in terms of microbia and invisible things that live in an invisible world. But lastly around flavor is that when we do have access to a much more profound flavor profile, it opens up our ability to taste so much more. And eating doesn't necessarily always have to be about enjoyment as it is, as we like to push it today. But it does allow you to have a broader experience and push for more and more different kinds of recipes and adapt and evolve according to what's available. You'll have a better, a better pantry, a bigger pantry, better access to a better pantry. One of the other things that, so we go from the British, and now it's apartheid. And we have, as we all in our memory have, and still existing, this idea of spatial planning. And so it's obvious in many places, but I think in the Cape, because the Cape is so much smaller and so coastal, there is a very obvious kind of below the railway line, or even just away from the mountain kind of spatial planning. And in terms of food production and in terms of urban farmers and producers, everybody that used to live in the fertile zones around the mountains, for example, got pushed into the Cape Flats, into the townships, from Mitchell's Plain to Khayelitsha to Fuleni, Gugulet, to this huge, expansive area, Philippi, that is basically sand. And so now your cultivation, in our recent history, your cultivation is going from a much browner, much more nutrient-dense, more fertile, more rich, more clay, because the mountain is very clayey. Easy access to water, and not just water like brakwater or whatever, but sweet water, the kind of water that, can you imagine the beetroots that are grown with that water? Now you move down to the flats where the water is brak, where the water smells like sulfur a lot of times. My friend Tasneem calls grassy park grassy fart, because it smells like sulfur all the time. and the soil is much thinner, to use that word. Like it's obviously it's sand and it doesn't clump, and sometimes there's a little bit of clay, but the point is that it's very acidic. And so it's a different way of farming, and if you can farm on the Cape Flats, you know things, because it's basically farming on the beach. It's white sand compared to here. Can you imagine if your sand, like your soil was white where you grow your food? And a lot of what happened in that forced removals as well is that before, in areas that were more mixed, so let's obviously, like District 6 is an obvious example, when in the days of District 6, people were sharing food. There were pots of food, no one was going hungry. This is kind of the stories of my grandparents and a whole lot of other people, but the stories that come out of that time. But when apartheid came and forced removals happened, you were no longer sharing food. There was no longer a space for you to rest your head. There wasn't an open door anymore. Things changed, you know. My uncle also says, you know, we used to have, everybody had a voorkamer, and there was always a couch in the voorkamer. And when people were forced to move, they were like, nah, but this couch has seen better days, we're going to leave it here. And then they would buy new furniture. And then the door was locked, because now I don't want you coming with the oily head, sleeping on the couch the whole time, and ruining these things that cost a lot of money. So the hidden effects that something like forced removals have go a lot further than the obvious things. And one of them was that people stopped sharing food. So whereas my mother and my grandmother then grew up with a much more mixed account of a food experience, when we were kids, we grew up with a very Cape Malay food experience, which means that I didn't even know what pork was until I was like, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9, because I'd never had that experience before. Until by mistake I swapped my lunch with someone at school and my mother found out. But this idea of the separation of communities who have differing cultures ordinarily there wouldn't have been that gap or that wall between now exists. We come from a culture as South Africans of conviviality and reciprocity, and apartheid changed that, and it shut things down and it blocked things off, and how this affects our food culture. Okay, so we've gone from this idea of a generously abundant place very quickly begins to be shut down, that by 500 years later, 1994 rolls around and we have democracy. But as Arundhati Roy says, democracy is basically like, this is not a direct quote, but is akin to just neoliberalism, right? It's neoliberal capitalism. We then, because of the trade embargoes that existed pre-94, trade wasn't allowed apart from the botanical world, which is a whole other story about Kirstenbosch. The ANC at the time was like, no, dope, we should just open up as far and wide as we can. And privatization was the way to do that. And so you see things like, do you guys remember Dairy Bell? Dairy Bell, no? Yeah, Dairy Bell. So we used to have a very different system of dairy within the country. And you'd have a lot more dairy producers in urban spaces. Privatization comes in, palm a lot comes in. A lot of that stuff stops and ends, and there's not a lot of access to a decentralized system. It's now become very centralized, and you often have to go through the supermarket system to access things like milk, right? It stops getting delivered. It's now all about financial exchange. Yeah, so there's, okay, we can, I'm also just wearing the time, so I'm going to go into the point of where are we now? I don't know how it is here, but in the Cape, everybody is foraging. Foraging, meaning gleaning, meaning gathering. It's like a dirty word now. It's not something, like I've even stopped doing workshops around it, because when, like, I want to go harvest some seaweed at the sea, I go there and someone has decimated the entire stand. So there's this idea that it's so like, It's very trendy, but it's very, very problematic, and it's become something that's quite quickly moved into very exclusive spaces, high-end restaurants, so you have to pay a lot of money to access these indigenous foods. And then, so me on my pluck, doing lots of workshops and forums and stuff with producers, with fishers, with farmers, and trying to everyone is with us. And approaching these topics around indigenous food with fishers and farmers and people outside of the city, who are really kind of living way below, living poverty line lifestyles. There's still, one of the things that I would, blame that imperial chic, is that way of the British, was that there's still this aspirational context that exists. So when we talk about alternative food security for those who are living in terms of bread basket, basic bread basket, it's, across the board, everyone's like, "Nah, dice, I don't know, I'm not going to eat the stuff that we took out of the ground," right? That to the point that when I was doing the first workshop I did with fisherwomen and seaweed, the only way that it worked was when we brought the children. And we said, okay, now the kids must be, let's all play together, because everyone uses seaweed to dress up with, right? No one's eating it. And we can harvest with the children and then ask their caregivers to cook for them, and together kind of workshop this idea that it becomes a plausible thing. It's not something that this lady from Cape Town has come to teach us about. It's a tangible thing, and it's something that is much more easy to assimilate, especially because it's so nutritious and delicious. But a lot of these foods are not delicious, so why would people want to take them on? And so you also go through the whole chain of, okay, but what other indigenous foods are there? Of course, there's the easy ones, like limpets, like the coastal foods, but when you're inland, it becomes a little bit difficult. So the other issue that we're facing within this time is what Frank Matose calls the militarization of conservation. This is, Shane, he's been writing this for a long time, but he's the person to speak to about it. It's this idea that conservation has become that utopian ideal, where I look across the landscape and I do not see one person. Because people is separate to nature, right? Human and nature don't coexist. And so it has to be a pristine landscape where there's no buildings, where there's no pollution, all of these things. But essentially, people are living there. And so it becomes a new type of forced removal. Even to the point that Table Mountain National Park, people used to live on Table Mountain, like generationally. 1970-something comes in, and now everybody is forced off. And now they have to find a new space to live, where they don't have access to clean water and to harvesting as they have been for generations. And this is also true for particularly worst off fisher peoples around the coast, especially in terms of marine protected areas. Now there's the quota system. You need to get a permit to be able to do what you've been doing for all these generations. And the effect on livelihoods such as those is by far worse than if someone tells me that I can't harvest seaweed anymore, right? So there's a lot that's happening that we don't we don't get to see at the forefront. How are we for time? 6:04. We are out of here completely. No one is here anymore. It's 7 o'clock. So I'm gonna quickly go through this, and then we're gonna go through this last slide, and then we're gonna go through this. Okay, so I just wanted to, this has been a very important part of my journey, and so I wish to share it, because what's been happening in all the kind of workshops and meetings and like business what-whats that I go to and I'm a part of, and people want to start bringing indigenous food into their practice, whether it's their art or or indigenous anything, or their restaurant or cafe or recipe that they're selling something in the supermarkets. To be able to have access to the stuff and capitalize on it, you need to do the work. And the work is that of understanding the depth and the antiquity of the trauma that indigenous peoples and the land and ocean has experienced because of this big story that I told you. that is why a lot of this knowledge and practice is extinct. And a lot of the plants and animals are extinct. And so, for me to be able to do that is a journey of many years, many crises of self, and trying to understand if I deserve to do this work. And I'm probably very self-critical compared to most people, but it's helped me so far. Also, quite a bit of depression, to deep dive as to why, like what happened, how can we revive these kinds of things. And in those dark moments, when one finds the light in the darkness, a lot of these answers begin to come to us through dreaming. And a lot of these answers come to you in the moments that you wake up. Like, oh, that's why it didn't taste nice, I've got to do that. Or, you know, I've tried the same recipe. Do you guys know obeya? It's like a carrion flower. The flowers smell like rotting flesh. And they look like fingers, right? They grow all over the region. But they are so bitter, so bitter. But I managed to get them once to taste like asparagus with a hint of artichoke that you wanted to eat it with all different kinds of cheeses, right? But I've never been able to do that again. And so I dream those things and I seek answers, and a lot of it is a very deep spiritual practice. So there's lots of ritual involved. There's lots of kind of ancestral calling, and a lot of processing of trauma. Because at the end of the day, a lot of this trauma that has happened continues to happen. And each time we capitalize on somebody else's labor is when that trauma gets exacerbated. And so to process the trauma is a very specific state you have to be in, but it's to hold that, you know, the grief, basically, and process it no matter how that turns out. And then the last 2 points is around utilizing art as a tool. I've got an example and I'm going to show you some pictures. But using art to express these issues, because it speaks many more words than I can. So I could have just done this with a whole lot of paintings, but I chose to speak to you guys. And then the last thing that happened was I've really been so open about it, but so I have come out of this very dark depression about 2 years ago. And in it, when I was in the darkest of it, a friend of mine, I met a friend and from Mexico, and he started trying to help and saying, okay, how can I be in support of your process and your activism and your work? And so I was like, if I have to clear it all out, the most obvious, all of the other stuff is almost superficial compared to the healing that the land needs to go through. And the easiest way to tell that story is through food, because everybody's eating. If I'm now going to talk about air conditioner, no one's going to care. Or what we can use as paint, it's not important. But food is an integral point, and it speaks to many different species, many different livelihoods, many different ways of being and timescapes. And so he said, okay, well, that's a great connection to Mexico, because Mexico has also had colonization, violent, traumatic colonization. Yet, for some other reason, this idea of indigenous food has always maintained. And the indigenous food has become a weapon, has become a tool, whereas we never got that opportunity in the seat of colonialism we came. Right. Okay. So we are going to go through these plants, and then I'm going to welcome you when you guys go. I also have all of these. I don't need to go home with these, please. Yay, but there are some things that I do need to go home with, so feel free. Okay, so let's start on this side. And we're going to pass around. Those of you who need to go, don't be afraid, you're welcome. Thank you for coming. Okay, so this guy, and this one, and this one. This one that's very Philip Shamey was in the computer bag, that's why you see it. And these are 3 cousins in the same family. Okay, when we speak about plants, we can speak about them in terms of family, because that's kind of how they relate to one another. So plants is also genus and species, like, every other species, but that's how people tend to refer to them these days. Unfortunately, our first language in plants is Latin, So I'm trying to break that, but that's how I learned it. But these guys are called pelargonium. Okay? So these are 3 kinds of pelargonium. They all have different properties, they all grow differently, and they all smell foul. And okay, so you could propagate these. This one, I don't think you can propagate him anymore. But if you want to propagate this one, you're going to have to do it by layering. So you're going to cut it up and you're going to bury this whole thing in soil. You can't do it that way. This one, however, you can stick in the ground and it'll surely grow. So let's break it up so everyone can get a smell. This is one of the pelargoniums that are like called rose pelargonium. So there's a whole lot of them that smell like rose, and they all have a typical leaf pattern. Why don't you pass it back? Can I ask you to pass it around, please? So just like rub it with your fingers and smell it, so rub it with your hands and smell your hand. And then this guy the same, except it smells like lemon. So it has the same phytochemical as lemongrass citronellum. That idea? Do you like it?
Yes.
Why don't you pass it around? This one is my favorite. And then this last one that looks a little bit better, this is mint pelargonium. Like the other two love the sun, this one loves the shade. So, I think it's just a mechanism to survive light and insects and general damage, because the other ones are not, they're much more dangerous. A good way to use these. That's a mint one. So a good way to use them, or an easy way to substitute it into your lifestyle of cooking and stuff, is when you bake. So across the board, everybody's baking, right? When you bake, put this at the base of the baking tin, or chop it up into the batter, so that when you put it under heat, all the volatile oils imbibe into the batter. It's delicious. What's really nice about that mint one, the one that looks a bit like ganja, the spiky one, I mean not the mint one, the lemon one, yeah. So what's really nice about that is because of its hard texture, when you bake it, it like caramelizes. So it also lends itself to being caramelized. So you can make like chips. And you should find that one in your nurseries, but I'm not sure if you do. Okay, quick sticks. Then this one is really cool. I'm just gonna, you can pass it around. We'll get there eventually, but it will also be here in the front. This is Polyonema alba, right? It doesn't mean much, but what it's also called is aaspos. And aaspos means bait, right? So in the same way, okay, so put it this way. So fishes, when they go out fishing, there's this thing called red bait. There's actually, all bait stinks, right? It smells like the fishiest fish. And because it's an animal product, bait, it sticks to your animal cells in your body very easily because of the oil. So it's difficult to wash that out and smell nice again. And so the story goes that the fishermen used to come home and the women used to say, you stink. But the only thing that will kill that smell is aaspos. In the same way that garlic and parsley apparently work, well, they've tried it, because garlic is amazing. So this is the same thing. So when you get it, those of you who have had it, sorry, but you want to rub it. And what's really nice also is if you add a little bit of water to that, you can literally just wash your hands. It smells like polish.
What's it called again?
Polyonema. It's alba, pulchellum, there's a whole lot of different species. At this time of year, confetti bush is the English name. They give these like little flowers. And it's also actually, its indigenous name is buchu. Because, but it's not buchu. It's not buchu like we think of buchu being that Agatha me what. Buchu basically means, the meaning of the word is strong smelling, right? So in the same way, have you guys ever smelled dasypus? If you haven't, you must. It smells very sweet. And it's used, they have these musk glands literally where they excrete things. And so it's it's a very sought after ingredient in perfumery, right? Dasypus, literally. But it's also a sought after medicine. So it's used in many tea items, right? But dasypus, my point of telling you about this is that it's also called buchu, because it's got such a strong scent. So this is also. Okay, folks. So I'm not going to pass this around, but this is. Does this come up for you guys on the side?
Oh, we from Escape, so we know it as cedar.
Yes.
And we were saying we used to eat it all the time. And we used to go, dogs pee on that.
When I give the walks and I tell people just don't eat the stuff near the poles. So what's really cool about it's seedings exactly, meaning like little sour rings. And what like the fancy chefs are doing now is that they pluck the leaves and then they use them like little green hearts. It's so pretty. And then so this is one that comes up in winter and it goes completely dormant in summer. So you can get a field of them and you come back there at the end of September and there's nothing. So these are those. They work very well in fermentation because they lift the pH. They make it more acidic. Lift. They lower the pH. And it works very well. It's the typical like colonial recipe book uses this as a substitute to lemons for Waterblommetjie. And it's also an important tool for back in the days before vitamin C pills and oranges. It's very high in vitamin C, so it can push off scurvy. And this thing about you guys eating it as kids is such a common thing. A lot of us ate it as kids. And I don't know why I still got sick, but it's full of vitamin C, and so everybody should be eating it. But also to say that it's high in oxalic acid. And oxalic acid, you probably need to eat about 1 kilogram of this to feel the effects of it, but some people are allergic to that, so just try it a little bit first. This one I'm also going to leave here. This is, we call this sali, rain sali, brown sage. Don't know why they call it sali, but anyways. And this is our version of sage. So sage is a family that lives all around the world. Salvia is the name, right? So the obvious one is the European salvia, the one that we fry with butter when we serve lamb or ravioli or whatever, which is quite sweet. There is a salvia, I think, that grows at the lower part of the Cedarburg in the Western Cape, that is called Salvia De La Musica. So it likes to grow in Dolomitic, yeah, right? But it has big leaves and it's sweet and it's very reminiscent of that European one without the bitterness. This one, however, is a very, it's a very earthy flavor, much more smoky, a little bit more bitter, but it works amazingly. The flowers are great as well because if you pluck them and you get them on a dewy morning, then you get this tiny little drop of dew, of sap. You can't really see it. Can you see it? See it in the light? It's the sweetest thing here. But it's like a droplet. So this is, if you imagine you were an insect, like a bee, and you could just put your proboscis in there and have like your morning cup of sugar. Amazing. So I tell people that you can taste it. If you let it linger on your tongue for too long, it's bitter because this is very bitter. But don't steal the coffee of the bees. Don't take too much. Okay, and then this, does anybody know what this is? Aloe flowers are delicious. But it's the same thing. This is the vital sex organ of the plant. It's its only chance to make babies if it's not doing it vegetatively, right? And on top of that, aloes flower in winter. And in terms of our bees, again, I'm not only about this mono species, but bees are kind of important in terms of economy. This is one of the most potent or strong, if I can say, plant proteins that bees can access in a time when there's not a lot of other stuff to forage. So don't now go eating all the aloe flowers because they need it. But you can eat this one because it came from a garden. But generally you want to eat the ones that are still closed, but these ones you can still eat. But then when they're open, just be aware that there's lots of others that like to eat these plants, and there might be insects in there, so just give it a tap before you eat it. unless you don't mind eating insect. And then obviously everybody knows sour figs, right? Okay, this is just a good example. Please take those home. Okay. Yeah, exactly. What are you asking? So okay. So the reason I bought this also is because this is probably the most obvious indigenous food that still exists in terms of economy, right? Any person who's living around a national park can get a permit. There's no holds on the permit. There's no system for permits. I mean, no like block on this permits. And you can go collect as many sour figs as you can. And so thus they get sold all around. Many recipes abundantly made around them. Everybody has an auntie who knows how to make them fake. But there's many other recipes you can make from them. But it's still a very valuable indigenous food. And so after people say rooibos and snoek, then I say, what about feigies? Oh yes, feigies. They don't exist anywhere else in the world.
Zayaan, are there different sour fig plants? Because we have lots of these, but we don't have
the fruits. So a lot of the fruits are quite insignificant. These ones tend to be quite big, and then there's another one that's even bigger. But after that, I think the only other feigies you can eat fruits of, you can eat the leaves. Whereas these leaves you can eat, but they're very astringent and they're probably better in a smoothie. But in terms of other family of copper
But even ones that look like that with the leaves. So
it might be a pollination thing. Just go there with a paintbrush and paint the flowers and pollinate them and see what happens. Because that could be that. And also send me a picture. Okay, and then the obvious ones. When we talk about insects, also the most common insects found commercially are mopani. Everybody knows tarantulas. Okay, so because this is one of those things that people like, if in Cape Town and in major cities, people don't want to eat worms, right? But you go anywhere else, you're like, yeah, mopani worms, yeah, we eat ants, we eat this and that. So there's this idea, this aspirational thing, right? But what I have today for you, and I'm not going to pass it around because we don't have time, is mopani crisp bread. What? That might have been left in the oven for 2 minutes too long, so don't judge me. But that's been made with mopani worms, garlic powder if you're allergic to garlic. It's wheat flour, salt, very amazing salt, and kapokos. So when I was talking earlier on about our indigenous rosemary, this is kapokos, most famously known for Karoo lamb. The flavor of Karoo lamb is because when it's drought time, which is the last 5 years, they're eating mostly this. And there's many different species of this kapokos. But what's also really dope about this is they have, at this time of year, these little floofy seed heads. And these make really good cigarette, like Enchi filter replacements, right? So you can wrap your cigarette with that. But it's also easy to propagate. Welcome to all of that. Lots of sea stuff to come see. Umondi. Does anybody know Umondi or YTI? This is very easy to find at the Muti market. I don't know where else you can find it. If you nibble it, so it's a creeper with a white flower, but if you nibble it, it tastes like our version of licorice. So it's very bitter, little bit of sweetness at the end, but the bitterness is very smoky. So it's got that's a typical flavor of this landscape, throughout the region. Mondi or YTI. MONDIA, something like that. And then white, II. I think the most important thing on all of these tables is this white crystal. This is salt from the last remaining hot spring that this landscape has that's not privatized. This is from Baleni in Limpopo. It's called Baleni salt. Harvested in the same custom as it has been for at least 2,000 years by the Tonga woman. It moves, so it comes out of a hot spring, but this hot spring moves throughout this river. And so it comes up in a different place each season. And then they'll harvest as much as they wish. and depending how like low or high the water is, whether it's drought or not, means how much mineral is in the salt. So it's not often that the salt comes out quite white. It's usually this color or darker. And that is because of its mineral richness. So it's a salt, but it's not a salty salt. It's not like a NaCl salt. So it's got many other minerals in it, of which I've forgotten, but I have it all on their website, badeni.co.za. And it is, I think, the most sacred of salts that we have. Salt is something that we have in abundance in South Africa. Desert salts, coastal salts, ocean salts, hot spring salts, salts that come from plants. So have a taste of that. Baobab, you know Baobab. Thank you, Claire, for bringing. And then you guys have this also a lot here, right? Amantumbulu. Yeah? Also called numut. It's used very much with the city parks people. They use this as a roadside plant. It's used for security because it's got big thorns. Most railway stations have it in the Cape. So those of you who are from Cape Town, next time when you take the train, just have a look. But they have these really amazing fruits that to me taste like how cola should taste, like traditional cola, not Coca-Cola, but the fruit cola. There's this like acidity and sweetness and sourness and like lingering. It's very astringent, not very, it can be astringent. It has a milky latex, but you can eat it, it's fine. When I was talking about geophytes, the Watsonia, the storage corms, so we didn't have seeds in the Cape, we had bulbs, which means that you have to harvest the whole plant, so you're like killing the whole plant as opposed to just eating the seeds, right? But if it's in abundance, then it's a kind of population control. These, I don't know if we'll have time for photographs, but these, a friend of ours, there was a massive fire near Cape Point, and all the Watsonia still managed because there's a lot of like tunic and skin around this. So by the time the fire had passed, you'd go back to the Watsonias and they were like sweet potatoes, but not so sweet, sweeter than a potato, honestly, but like the texture of it was delicious. So the potential of that is amazing. Someone must take the speckworm, very edible and delicious, and vitamin C. This one is very interesting. This is lichen. We did this thing on Expresso TV yesterday talking about garam masala. And so I brought this for the nation, for the continent to see. Because lichen is a very important ingredient in garam masala, traditional garam masala, called kalpasi. Or I think it's called black stone flour or brown stone flour. You take lichen, not any lichen, but you roast it, and it releases those oils and that smell, and you grind it into a powder, and that's what gives curries and biryanis and stuff that flavor, that smell, which we don't really have anymore because no one's using this stuff. So I invite you to open it and take a deep sniff. And then the last things is, this is kukuma kranka, very typical fruit out of an amazing flower that typically gets stored and soaked in brandy. So this is probably like 5 years old now, so it must smell and taste like that abundantly.
How's that spelled?
Kukuma kranka. Just like it sounds. K-U-K-U-K-U-K-R-A. K-U. It can also be K-U. Yeah. Makranka. The Latin name is Gethyllis. G-E-T-H-Y-L-L-I-S. There are many families up in the Highveld, but they don't have the same smell. Lastly, so we also have some okra that Claire brought that's really beautiful. That's from East Africa originally. And then the last one is this Strelitzia. You know the tree Strelitzia. I took all the other stuff off it because it was full of mold. But it's from KwaZulu originally, but it's all over the country because of birds and because of landscapers and city parks. But what's amazing about this is the only way you can get the seed when it's ripe is if you have a beak. Because even if you take a pair of secateurs and you try to cut this thing open, your secateurs will break. This thing is so hard. We also have that like joke, we say that kelp is the forest of the sea, because also it's like, it's very, very hard. It's like a wooden thing. It's like wood from the ocean. This is also a very hard wood. These seeds, however, when they're fresh, you can eat them like nuts. They don't have that much of a flavor. It's more like a feeling than a flavor. But what's interesting is that you can eat it. So that's something that people used to do. It's even in that book, People's Plants. You crush it down into a flour and cut it to make a cake or to make bread. But what's interesting about it is that these little fluffy things are very oil rich, and they're amazing to use for under eye circles, dark circles. But it also, the pigment, this orange color, research has now seen that the pigment that this orange is one of the only known pigments that plants and humans share, and I'm sure other animals. In that when we bruise, and it goes from black to blue to purple, whatever, and then it goes that funny orange color. It's the same pigment that this is.